here on Zoom. Hopefully folks are familiar with the Zoom format. If not, we are using what's called the webinar product. That means imagine we are in the Milton High School auditorium. Josh and I are at the front. I'm at the podium. You are out in the seats. So we'll be giving a presentation. Once that presentation is over, we're going to open up a question and comment period. If you have a question, you can use the raise hand function on the bottom of your screen. That'll raise your hand on our participants list. Everyone that raises their hand will be entered into a queue. So, first one to raise their hand is first, second is second, et cetera, et cetera. Imagine you're lining up at the microphone in the aisle. Our little graphic here has the Q&A button circled. We don't have the Q&A function enabled tonight. So if you do have something that you want to ask or something that you want to say, use that raise hand function and we will take questions in order as they come. If you're on the phone, you can use the *9 to raise your hand, and that'll enter you into that queue. And then once you're able to talk, you can use *6 to mute and unmute yourself. We're going to do our best to try to hear from as many people as possible. So we're going to try to limit questions and comments to 3 minutes. I will try to be as concise in my answers as I can. I talk about this stuff a lot if given the opportunity, so I want to make sure that I use that discipline on myself as well. Again, this forum is open to the public, so there may be non-town meeting members here. What I would ask is that if you are not a town meeting member, to maybe hold off on raising your hand. I want to give town meeting members an opportunity to ask questions. If there's time at the end of the queue and you're a non-town meeting member and you want to kind of jump in, that's perfectly fine. We don't want to exclude anybody, but this is a forum that was directed kind of specifically towards town meeting members. We want to make sure that they all have an opportunity to ask any questions if they have them. So before we get started, I just want to point people to townofmilton.org/Milton MBTA. This is our website where we've been putting everything that we've done on MBTA communities since the start. Every presentation we've given, every public forum we've had, every bit of information, data, report that we've gotten from our consultants, information from the state, all of that is on the MBTA communities page. There are a number of things that I'll be referring to tonight that are posted on there right now. There's a fiscal impact analysis that's just recently been posted. There is a recording of this week's planning board meeting where our fiscal impact analysis consultants kind of explained their results and methodology. So I encourage you to go to that page. Anything that you want to know about what we've been doing on MBTA communities is there. So that's on townofmilton.org/Milton MBTA. So just to get started, as a means of introduction, what is the MBTA Communities Law? In January of 2021, the legislature passed a law and the governor signed it, amending Chapter 40A of Mass General Laws, which is the Zoning Act, to create a new Section 3A. So when we talk about MBTA Communities Law, when we talk about Section 3A, these are the same things. And that law basically said that any community that has MBTA service shall have at least one zoning district of reasonable size in which multifamily housing, which in state law is defined as 3 or more units in a building, or there's an alternative definition of multiple buildings with multiple units on a single parcel. Multifamily is permitted as of right and meets other criteria. The zoning district has to have a minimum gross density of 15 units per acre, not more than half a mile from transit. You can't put age restrictions in your zoning, and your zoning has to create housing that's suitable for families. So this is all in the law. The law also gives the state housing agency, at the time it was the Department of Housing and Community Development. They have since changed their name to a cabinet level secretariat. They are the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. The state housing agency was empowered to create guidelines to help towns comply with this law. What you see on the slide is a paraphrase of the law, but it's not that much of a paraphrase. It's a very short law, very much open to kind of interpretation and kind of additional specificity, which which the compliance guidelines drawn up by Housing and Livable Communities provides. And we'll talk about those guidelines a little bit more later. The statute also lays out a penalty for noncompliance. Towns that don't pass zoning are ineligible for certain state grant programs, including MassWorks, the Housing Choice Fund, and the Local Capital Projects Fund. There are additional penalties. I don't want to talk too much about noncompliance tonight because we're talking about going to town meeting to comply with this law. But obviously, if folks have questions later on about that, we can certainly answer them. So what the law is a mandate to create zoning. It is not a mandate for towns to create housing. And that's a distinction that sounds like a distinction without a difference, but it's actually very important. Our charge under the law is to pass zoning. And if we pass zoning on Monday or next Monday or next Tuesday or whenever it is, town meeting eventually takes a vote, and the state deems it to be compliant, then we're all set. We don't have to worry about penalties. We don't have to worry about any of the bad stuff that happens to non-compliant communities. Even if a single unit of housing is not built under our zoning, if it meets all the compliance guidelines, we are compliant. So there's a lot of questions about, what is the town going to do to promote housing? Are we going to take land? Are we going to bulldoze this? Are we going to build that? The town doesn't have to do anything except for pass this zoning. So I mentioned earlier guidelines from the Office of Housing and Livable Communities, which we shortened to HLC. They were empowered to issue guidelines to help towns understand how do you comply with this law. There are a number of things in the law that kind of need additional clarification. What does it mean for a district to be of reasonable size? What does it mean to be suitable for families with children? The guidelines are extensive. They are long, they are complicated, they are very, there's a lot to them. One of the things that the guidelines does is create categories of communities based on the level of transit service that they have. There are rapid transit communities, which are served by Red Line, Green Line, Blue Line, Orange Line, and portions of the Silver Line. There are commuter rail communities, which are served by commuter rail, obviously. And then there are adjacent communities, which are communities that don't have transit service within their borders, but are, have portions of their town that are within a half a mile of transit in another town. Each of those types of communities have different obligations under the guidelines. Milton, by virtue of being served by the Mattapan trolley, which is an extension of the Red Line, is categorized as a rapid transit community. So it's us and 12 other inner core communities, Quincy, Somerville, Cambridge, Medford, Revere, Newton, Brookline. These are all fellow rapid transit communities. So we've got a number of obligations under the law, one of which being our deadline for complying with Section 3A is December 31st, 2023. So that's just about a month away, which is why we're having this special town meeting on December 4th. So what are the requirements that we must meet under this zoning? The statute itself has requirements, and then the guidelines have additional requirements that interpret some of the more broad concepts that are in the law. So the overall density of our zoning district has to be 15 units per acre. The district itself has to be at least 50 acres in size. That's one way that the guidelines interpret the reasonable size requirement in the law. The other way that they interpret the reasonable size requirement is by something that they refer to as unit capacity. And this basically means that within that geography that you zone at 15 units per acre, that geography has to have the potential to accommodate up to 25% of the town's, or excuse me, at least 25% of the town's existing year-round housing count. So for Milton, that number is 2,461 units. That's our unit capacity number. We'll talk about unit capacity a little bit more in a minute. Another requirement is that at least 50% of that unit capacity and at least 50% of the minimum area has to be located within a half a mile of transit. Now, the law says the district has to be within a half a mile. The guidelines offer a bit of nuance to that, owing to the fact that a lot of towns, Milton included, when you draw a half a mile radius around our transit stations, a lot of that area is either in the Deposit River Reservation or in the city of Boston, by virtue of the location of our transit. And so, as a sort of acknowledgement of that, the state guidelines basically say, okay, not all of the developable area in your transit area is actually in your town, so you can't control it. So we're going to give you the flexibility to place a portion of your zoning district outside of the transit area. So we have the flexibility to do a 50-50 split. We can do sub-districts, so smaller districts. Doesn't have to be one whole big glob, but at least one sub-district must represent 50% of the total area of the district. So those are a kind of a really intricate web of requirements, and you'll see kind of how we try to navigate those a little bit later. But before we start, I want to talk about unit capacity because it's a number that has kind of captivated the imaginations of a lot of people in town and a lot of people in all of the MBTA communities. They look at these numbers and they say, "Wow, what is this?" Um, Unit capacity basically says you've got a zoning district and it allows you to build, X number of units on a parcel times however many parcels are in the district. That's your unit capacity. When they calculate unit capacity, they treat every parcel as a blank canvas. So this diagram kind of is a little bit of a good example. In that first box, you've got your sort of existing use. So today there's a duplex, which is a house with two housing units in it. So that's there today. All right. And that's it was built whenever, and it'll, two families live there, and it's great. When you're calculating unit capacity, you are pretending now that that doesn't exist. The parcel where that housing is on is a blank slate. And then you take your zoning, which says, in this case, you can build 4 units on this given parcel with these different dimensional parameters, height, setbacks, other kind of requirements. And that unit capacity is 4 now. So unit capacity doesn't take into account what's actually on the parcel today. The parcel can have 1 unit, 10 units, 100 units, no units. It treats every parcel as if there was nothing on it, and then says, if that parcel was developed, how many units could you build on it? And the unit capacity for the entire district is if all of the parcels in your district were blank slates and they all got redeveloped, how many units would that count as? So this is a metric the Commonwealth kind of created in order to judge communities under that kind of definition of reasonable size, which is 2 parts, kind of physical size of a geography, 50-acre minimum, and a capacity of how many units you can put in that district. It is an abstract figure. And when I say it's an abstract figure, I mean it's fake. It's fantasy. It's a math problem. It's a tool meant for the Commonwealth to judge zoning compliance under this specific set of guidelines. It is not a tool that anyone is using to predict build out. Our unit capacity number is 2,461. Nobody on Beacon Hill, at 100 Cambridge Street, where HLC is headquartered, in Town Hall, nobody is expecting that there will be 2,461 new units built under the zoning. Just like zoning is sort of a regulatory kind of paper exercise, unit capacity is a paper exercise. When and if parcels get redeveloped is a function of the real estate market, the broader economy, interest rates, inflation, all of that stuff, the circumstances of individual property owners. Dozens of factors go into the decision to redevelop a parcel under a given zoning scheme. And so it becomes difficult to almost impossible to predict actually how many units we can expect to be built in any given time frame under the zoning. I'll give you a good example. In 1938, when our current zoning was approved by town meeting, in the run up to that, there was a committee that was kind of convened to draw up zoning for the town of Milton. And they had their town meeting. It might have been in February of 1938. But this is an excerpt from an article in the Milton Register from January 28th. The 1938 zoning, which by and large we are still operating under, A zone, B zone, C zone business districts, they're all the same today, almost exactly as they were back in 1938. The committee that developed that zoning did their own sort of unit capacity kind of calculation, and they didn't really count units, but they counted, what is the expected, what can we expect, if this zoning was fully taken advantage of, how many new people in town could it accommodate? And that zoning was calculated to accommodate 60,000 residents in the town of Milton. Now, everybody knows that we've been holding steady at between 25 and 29,000 people for the past several decades. We haven't reached even half of the population capacity of our zoning in the course of almost 85 years. So this is just an example to kind of tell you that what you can do under zoning is not the same thing as what is actually done under zoning. And so I want people to keep that in mind as we talk about that unit capacity number, throughout this exercise. So the options that we have for compliance, we have a number of different factors that we can kind of adjust and figure out, ways to make it work for us. The location and the size of the districts is determined by how much developable area exists in that area. So I mentioned a good portion of our developable area actually isn't even in the town of Milton. So we get to pick up to 50% of our zoning district can be outside of that transit area. So that gives us flexibility in terms of where we can put these things. As I mentioned, we can create sub-districts. Different smaller geographies, they don't have to all be the same one. They can have different dimensional parameters. The restrictions on that are at least half of the district needs to be contiguous, right? So 50% of it has to be in one kind of bunch. And smaller sub-districts need to be a minimum of 5 acres. So we can't just zone a tiny parcel here, a tiny parcel there. They've got to be substantial kind of size parcels. The dimensional requirements, these are, heights, setbacks, density, open space requirements, parking requirements. They don't need to be uniform across these sub-districts. So the overall density of the district, which is the collection of sub-districts, needs to be 15 units per acre. So the example I have here is if you've got 2 sub-districts, one of them is half the district, the other is the other half of the district. One of those sub-districts can have an overall density of 5 units per acre, which is relatively low for multifamily. There's plenty of places in Milton where you've got 5 units per acre. You can do that, even though that's below the required 15 units per acre, as long as your other district, which is half of your total zoning district, makes up for it via higher density. So if that subdistrict adds up to 25 units per acre, you add those together, you divide it by 2 subdistricts, you get your overall density of 15 units per acre. So there's flexibility in these guidelines that we've been able to use to craft districts that we think are consistent with our values and consistent with our planning priorities. These restrictions are also serious constraints, which we'll demonstrate a little bit later in the presentation. So this is the map. This should be in your warrant. Hopefully folks have had a chance to take a look at this. This is what our zoning district looks like. And the zoning district is actually a collection of smaller sub-districts. I just wanted people to look at it overall. The different colors of the districts, the red sort of scalloped line is the transit area, is what we're calling it. So this is the area when you draw that half-mile radius around Mattapan Station, Capon Street, Valley Road, Central Ave Station, Milton Station, Butler, and Cedar Grove, you get this sort of scalloped line of overlapping radii. That's the transit area. That's the area in Milton that's within half a mile of transit. So we'll move on to some more detailed diagrams of these zoning districts, and we'll kind of, rattle them off. So we've got 6 sub-districts. A couple of them have smaller sub-districts within them, and that comprises the overall zoning district. Each sub-district is tailored to match, as much as we could, the existing built environment via restrictions on height, density, setbacks, and open space requirements. So where there is existing built environment, where there are existing buildings, we are doing our level best to match what is existing. And you'll see how that manifests itself in the dimensional requirements. So in no particular order, we've got East Milton Square as a sub-district. This is Granite Avenue North. This is the northern portion of the Granite Avenue sub-district. This is effectively one parcel to Granite Ave, where the Flatley office building is. Granite Avenue South, which makes up the state DPW yard and park and ride lot in the northern portion, and then the American Legion Hall in the southern portion. This is a sub-district we're calling Milton Station East. This is sort of the northern part of Milton Village, 88 Wharf, 2 Adam Street, 1 Elliott Street. This is Milton Station Bridge. We call it Bridge because it bridges the east and west portions. This is 36 and 50 Elliott Street, the old Milton Hill House and the new Milton Hill House. This is Milton Station West. This is effectively the Central Avenue Business District, the Hendry's Building, the Steel and Rye Building, 36 Central. You recognize these from the Central Ave Business District. This is our Mattapan Station District. The significant chunk of this is Unquity House, the senior housing that's owned by Milton Residence for the Elderly. In order to get to the 5-acre minimum for a subdistrict, we folded in some of the single family houses around. One thing that you'll see in our dimensional table is, we're zoning for relatively significant density on the big parcel, not a lot of significant density on the small parcels, but we did need to get up to 5 acres for this subdistrict. This is what we call the Blue Hills Parkway Corridor District. This is, either side of Blue Hills Parkway down to the Tucker School, plus a handful of the parcels on some of the side streets. And then finally, the Elliott Street Corridor Subdistrict. So this is kind of, the portion that really hugs the Mattapan Trolley. And these are the parcels that are kind of closest to transit among our collection of subdistricts. So I'm not going to, even though there's a ton of detail on this, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this chart, but this is the summary of our modeling of these subdistricts. The state has created a tool called the compliance model, which basically is an Excel worksheet that has all of the kind of restrictions and thresholds and requirements in the guidelines kind of in the back end of this. And so we input a geography using parcel data from our geographic information system. We input dimensional parameters. Here's the height restrictions, here's the setback restrictions, and it spits out a unit capacity number and, a kind of a thumbs up, thumbs down. Are these districts compliant according to the guidelines or not? This is the tool that, if and when town meeting passes our zoning, that the state is going to use to judge whether or not we're compliant. So we've been able to use this tool to do testing and to figure out, are we proposing something that the state is going to give their blessing to? So I just want to kind of draw your attention to a couple things. The max units per acre column, some of those numbers seem pretty high. 45 units per acre on Granite Ave, 45 units per acre at Mattapan Station, 40 at Milton Station, 30 in East Milton Square. We don't have a max units per acre on the Elliott Street corridor. What we do have on the Elliott Street corridor is a unit per lot maximum. We are only allowing 3 units per parcel in the Elliott Street corridor. That is the smallest, lowest amount of density that we can do and still have those be considered multifamily buildings. And the explanation for that is to come. But I just want to call your attention to the fact that in the other kind of larger parcel areas where we're kind of zoning for bigger apartment buildings, the densities are not kind of way out in left field to each other. They're all kind of relatively close. I also want to call your attention to the building and parking coverage figures. The inverse to maximum building and parking coverage is open space. So every one of these subdistricts has a 40% open space requirement, except for Blue Hills Parkway Corridor, which actually has a 50% open space requirement. So these are our subdistricts as the compliance model sees them. So the overall unit capacity of the entire collection of subdistricts is 2,586, which is a few more than 100 units over our minimum target of 2,461. It's very hard to kind of get that exact number without losing compliance on some of the other factors. So, we're a little bit over our minimum requirement, but not that much. Our overall density is 15.1 units per acre. So that means that we are just barely over the minimum requirement that the statute requires of 15 units per acre. So, when I say that we have adjusted all of the different dials and measurements that we could to get as close to the minimum requirements as possible, you know it's coming from the heart because you see that number 15.1 units per acre. Some of these other, metrics are other thresholds that the compliance model is interested in. But I wanted to call your attention to the overall density and the max units per acre to kind of show you that, a lot of these are kind of very similar. And one thing that I'll tell you is that, I'll use Milton Station as an example. We get 40 units per acre because that's just about what the density of 131 Elliott Street, the Hendry's building, and 88 Wharf on the other side of the district are. That's 38 units per acre and maybe 35 units per acre. So we've done a little bit of an incremental increase in allowable density, but not that much. And so when I say that we're trying to model off of what the existing kind of built environment is, that's kind of what I mean. And you'll see that a little bit more in the next slide, which is our kind of detailed zoning parameters number. So I'll again call your attention to the Elliott Street corridor, which 15-foot front setbacks, 20-foot combined side setbacks, 20-foot rear setbacks, maximum building height of 2.5 stories or 35 feet. I'll say you should recognize those numbers. Maybe you don't because you don't read the zoning bylaw like I do. That's the existing zoning in that zoning district. Milton Station, in the east portion, 6-story maximum height limit, 75 feet. That's 88 Wharf. Milton Station Bridge, 4.5-story height limit, 60 feet. That's New Milton Hill House. Milton Station West, 4.5-story, 60 feet. That's the Hendry's building. Granite Avenue North, 6-story, 75 feet. That's the existing Flatley building. All of these zoning districts and all of these dimensional parameters that we have, where there is an example of contextual built environment, we have pegged our dimensional requirements to those so that we are not building something that is wildly out of character with what's existing nearby. So just so everyone can kind of see what the breakdown is of that sort of, it was 2580 something was our kind of model capacity number. This is how it breaks down kind of sub-district by sub-district. And so I'll go from left to right. In the Blue Hills Parkway Corridor sub-district, the model capacity is 175 units. In the Mattapan Station sub-district, it's 228 units. The model capacity in the Elliott Street corridor is 480 units. In the Milton Station, Central Ave Station subdistrict, it's 618 units among those three kind of smaller subdistricts. In Granite Avenue North, it's 171 units. Granite Avenue South is 530 units. And then in the East Milton Square subdistrict, it's 423 units. Now, remember, this is unit capacity. So what these numbers are telling you is if every single one of these parcels had any building on it wiped away and new buildings were built under the proposed zoning, these are the number of units that you would get. When I say that scenario is unlikely to impossible, I think you only need to just think, what if every single building on this map was wiped away and rebuilt at the same time? And that's why unit capacity is, again, an analytical tool and not a predictive tool of kind of real build out. So one thing I want to note is that the original guidelines that the state issued last year allowed you to allow mixed use as a use in your zoning districts. You could allow mixed use anywhere you want, but you couldn't require mixed use in your zoning district. So if you can imagine a scenario where, you purchase the Brugger's building, and no, I'll use Milton Village as an example. You purchase the building where Craft and Crew is in the Central Avenue Business District. So there are 2 businesses in that building right now, 3 businesses actually, and you redevelop it into a multifamily housing building under this zoning. We've got a nice new multifamily building, but now we've also lost commercial uses, which add, commercial tax base to the town. They add vitality to the district. A lot of towns saw these guidelines and were like, so many of our business districts are also in our transit areas, and we are running the risk of losing vital commercial spaces if developers were to decide to, only develop multifamily instead of mixed use. So the guidelines were changed recently to allow towns to create what we're calling a mandatory mixed use district. So we can take a sub-district that includes up to 25% of our unit capacity and kind of wall that off as like a separate sub-district and say, in this mandatory mixed use sub-district, you are now required to do mixed use if you want to redevelop under the zoning. So in order to preserve the commercial uses in the Milton Village and Central Ave business districts, those are the districts that we've identified as our mandatory mixed use. So Article 1 will create the overall kind of zoning, for 3A. And then Article 2 is the article that will establish the mandatory mixed-use district in the Milton Village and Central Ave business district. So it's kind of a 1-2 package, and we're hoping that everyone, will vote for both articles. Now, one thing I want to note is because we are restricted to 25% of our unit capacity, we couldn't do both Milton Village, Central Ave, and East Milton as mandatory mixed use because those sub-districts are too big together, and we had to make a choice. Now, the reason we made that choice is because we have a separate parallel zoning process going on in East Milton that's actually been going on for quite some time. We've been doing quite a bit of planning in East Milton, predating MBTA communities. And the way that we have drawn up our requirements and restrictions for East Milton Square under MBTA communities is to basically create a credible zoning scheme that will get us credit for unit capacity under MBTA community zoning, but we are aiming for the other zoning that we're trying to create, a mixed-use overlay, not dissimilar to the recent Milton Village overlay that town meeting approved in 2020. We want to do something like that in East Milton that will be much more attractive to the development community and will be informed by a lot more community process, a lot more planning that we've done in East Milton over the number of years. And so when we eventually write that zoning, that is the zoning that is going to require mixed use in East Milton. It'll be, much more attractive to the development community. And so it's a way that we're able to protect that sub-district through another means. And now we can save another district for mixed use via the mandatory mixed use allowance under MBTA communities. So we've been talking a lot about the sub-districts, and we've been talking a lot about the dimensional parameters. There's another element of the zoning, which is the review procedures and the sort of submission requirements, which makes up a significant portion of the zoning language in your warrant. And so I wanted to review a couple of those procedures right now. Every project that is built under our MBTA community zoning will be subject to site plan review by the planning board. Site plan review is a way for the planning board to look at kind of bigger projects, more impactful projects, more out of the ordinary projects, and evaluate their physical impacts and propose reasonable conditions that can mitigate traffic, mitigate stormwater impacts, design, other impacts, lighting. So site plan review is subject to a public hearing. It's subject to abutters notices and notice in the newspaper, public comment. I mean, if you've been to the planning board for site plan review, you know that it is a rigorous process. And so this isn't something where you just walk into the building department and get your building permit. You have to go to the planning board. Abutters to these projects are going to be notified. They'll know whether something's going on. They'll have an opportunity to talk to the planning board about, what this proposed project is going to do in the neighborhood, and, have that conversation about how we can kind of reasonably condition these projects so that they kind of fit in an effective way. So what goes hand in hand with site plan review is development standards. Again, it's not just height, setback, open space, parking requirements, and then you're off to the races. We've included a number of development standards that are going to help the planning board shape these projects so that they, mitigate as many of their impacts as possible and fit into their neighborhood context as well as possible. One of those is we've set parking maximums for residential uses. One of the problems that you see throughout the region is zoning bylaws and zoning ordinances that require more parking than is necessary for projects. And what that leads to in some cases is you're not getting as much housing built because you're building too much parking. You're not getting as much commercial space because your land area is eaten up with parking. And that parking either goes underutilized, so it's a kind of pointless land use, or it gets utilized more than you would want it to be, which puts cars on the road. So there's a really fine balance that you need to strike with parking so that you're not over parking and you're not under parking, which has its own impacts. And what we find in planning is that the people that are actually building the buildings and operating buildings and developing property have a lot better idea of how many parking spaces their residents are going to need than a zoning bylaw does. And so parking maximums basically says you can't build more than X number of spaces per unit in this development, and that prevents the overparking. One of the sort of really important pieces of research we have right here in the Commonwealth is an analysis by the Metropolitan Area Planning Council of 200 multifamily buildings in the inner core kind of greater Boston area. And what they found was that an average of 30% of required parking spaces were empty at peak time. So empty during the day for commercial uses, empty at night for residential uses. So what that indicates to us is zoning tends to require more parking than is necessary for a given project. So when you have a minimum parking requirement, you're building parking that no one's using. So we think that the parking maximums are going to be a really good way to modulate parking and traffic impacts on these neighborhoods. We've got open space and recreation requirements. Like I said earlier, 40% open space requirement in all of these districts, except for Blue Hills Parkway, which has a 50% requirement. Larger projects are going to be required to have an on-site play space or common area for use by families that are living in that project, so that we're not overburdening other open spaces, and we've got places for kids to play on site. There are design standards about building orientation, location of building entrances, site planning that will help the planning board, again, shape these projects so that they're fitting into the neighborhood context. There's also provisions in the zoning for the planning board in the future to develop even more specific design guidelines, which are going to be tailored towards individual zoning subdistricts that can help them really drill down into what is the specific design context of these districts. And so that's something that the planning board is going to have the discretion to do, in the future, if this zoning passes. So one thing we've heard a lot about is affordable housing. One of the purposes of this law is that there is a housing crisis in Massachusetts. We have not built enough housing to accommodate the demand for people to live here in the Commonwealth, and especially in greater Boston. So the idea behind the law is that we need to increase the supply of housing everywhere, not just in Boston, not just in Quincy, not just in Cambridge, but everywhere in Eastern Massachusetts. And so this is what the MBTA Communities Law is hoping to do. Now, the original guidelines did not include any provision for deed-restricted affordable housing. The point of the law is to kind of stabilize and lower prices on the market, but there was no provision for deed-restricted affordable housing for low and moderate income households. So there was another relatively recent change to the compliance guidelines that said, okay, every town can require up to 10% of units in their MBTA community zoning projects to be deed-restricted affordable housing. So our zoning includes this 10% requirement for buildings 10 or more units, because you can't have a 10% requirement on a 3-unit building because one unit in a 3-unit building is actually now 33%. So this will apply to our larger buildings that are built under the zoning. The guidelines allow for a greater affordability requirement if you can do an economic feasibility study that demonstrates that projects will still be economically viable with that higher affordability requirement. We have not done it yet, but we are actually in the process of drawing up a solicitation for firms to do that economic feasibility analysis for us. So, once that analysis is done, it may be subject to a future town meeting action to adjust that affordability requirement upward. We don't know how much upward, whether it's 12% or 15%, but we're going to want to have, the maximum feasible affordable housing requirement in our zoning, which right now is 10, but could be more in the future. So I want to talk about how we got to where we are with Article 1 and Article 2. Some of you may have been following this process from the very beginning, which I'm glad to have you on board. Some of you, this may be the first time that you're actually getting an in-depth look into the kind of sausage making that created zoning here. We've been working for more than a year, actually, since at least October of 2022 when the final guidelines came out. But since at least March, we've been working with various technical assistance consultants to determine the right location for subdistricts, the right dimensional parameters for projects in the subdistricts, and the right development standards and review procedures. So MBTA Communities has been the subject of discussion at 28 planning board meetings. We've had 8 public forums, including this one tonight. I've just been informed that we're up to 498 survey responses for a kind of rolling online survey that we've been doing to get feedback. We've set up a listening post at the Milton Farmers Market on 4 different occasions. The planning board sponsored a mailing that went into every water bill that we sent out over the past 3 months. So everyone in town has gotten a mailing that says MBTA Communities is a thing. Go to the town website and look it up, get on the mailing list, come to these forums, get educated on this. We've been doing social media and town website posts all along, and we've done some direct outreach to town meeting members. You hopefully got a letter back in July just informing you, like, hey, MBTA Communities is a thing you're going to have to vote on at town meeting at some point. Here's our website. And then we obviously did some direct outreach to get you all at this meeting tonight. So we've been working hard on this for more than a year, and really been digging into the weeds of dimensional parameters, of sub-district boundaries, for the better part of 9 months with our technical assistance consultants. So we've got the law and we've got the compliance guidelines that put all sorts of requirements and restrictions on our zoning districts. And I don't want to say it would be easy, but it would be easy to come up with any of a number of compliant districts just based on the requirements that are in the law and the guidelines. But we've also got some internal principles that have been animating our work. And these are principles that are derived from previous planning efforts, the master plan, the housing production plan, the final report of the Equity and Social Justice for All Committee, other kind of smaller planning efforts that we've been doing over the course of years where we've learned, what do people care about when it comes to the built environment in the town of Milton? What do people care about when it comes to housing and kind of the look and feel of their neighborhoods and all of that? And so we've got 7 kind of broad principles that have been guiding our work and really kind of putting what I would call internal constraints on the zoning beyond the constraints that are in the law and the guidelines. And those principles are, and this is kind of the first among equals among these principles, is to preserve the physical character of town. We hear this again and again whenever we do a big planning process, whenever we do a small review, well, not small, but a review procedure for a special permit project or site plan approval. People treasure the physical character of the town. And so that is a really big principle that we try to follow. We don't want to exceed the requirements in the statute and guidelines. We want to comply, we want to follow the rules, but we're not interested in zoning for 4,000 units. We're not interested in rezoning the entire town. So we want to, come as close as we can to hitting those minimum requirements. We want to disincentivize teardowns. This is of a piece with preserving the physical character of town, but where we are compelled to rezone areas where there is existing residential fabric, we want to create conditions where you can redevelop those parcels without tearing down a house. We want to avoid rezoning historic districts and parcels with historic structures. Um, Sometimes we're more successful than in other times, but we've really tried to, where we've got a historic district, we don't want to put those districts at risk. And so we've done our best not to zone there. We want to zone larger non-residential parcels so that we are taking as much advantage as we can of areas where there is not existing residential housing stock, to prevent displacement and to minimize the impacts on residential neighborhoods. We want to take advantage of existing multifamily housing. Um, we don't have compliant zoning districts that can sort of, we can just check a box and say we already have an MBTA communities district, but we do have an okay amount of multifamily housing, especially in sort of the Milton Village kind of transit area. And the way that we can take advantage of those areas is, and I'll use the example of 131 Elliott Street, the Hendry site. So that is an area that's been rezoned for 40 units per acre. So we rezone that parcel. We get credit for 40 units of unit capacity because that's a 1 acre parcel. The requirement says that you can develop 40 units there. That is a brand new building. The likelihood that that building in our lifetimes or in any reasonable timeline gets redeveloped for additional housing, 2 more units over the 38 that are there, is infinitesimally small. And so what we're doing is getting credit for unit capacity, but not having to worry about an actual redevelopment. Um, we've got an okay amount of multifamily housing, but we have a lot of areas where we're going to be rezoning, and if anything gets built, it's going to be new multifamily housing. But we want to take advantage of as much of that existing multifamily housing as we can. And then finally, we want to site districts in transit and amenity-rich areas. The point of this law is to create transit-oriented development. We are able to site up to 50% of our district outside of the transit area. And where we have done that, what we've tried to do is put it in places where residents of those districts have the best chance of living a car light lifestyle, where not every errand that you run has to be something that you hop in the car to do, where potentially you could work from home or walk to work or take the bus if the train isn't available, or use your car in a way that every part of your life does not require you to sort of get on the road and get in a car. And there's a lot of reasons why we want to incentivize that type of lifestyle. There's climate reasons, there's direct kind of physical impact reasons in terms of additional traffic on our roads. So we want to make sure that our districts are in transit and amenity rich areas. So these aren't ironclad rules. There's not one sub-district that checks all 7 of these boxes. But what we tried to do is, when we were identifying sub-districts, we want to apply as many of these principles to these sub-districts as we can. So over the course of the last 9 months, we tested at least 30 options that led to the final approach to compliance that you see in the warrant for the special town meeting. And there are kind of 5 time periods. We had early studies where we just got our hands on the compliance model, and we were just kind of figuring out a baseline of what does it look like to zone, the transit area. We winnowed that down to 2 fundamental options, and you'll see those, in a few minutes. This is work that happened at the planning board. So, based on planning board input, we chose option 1. You'll see what option 1 is in a minute. But after we picked option 1, we went through several rounds of iteration where, our consultants would show them options. The planning board would provide feedback, go back to the shop, generate new options based on that feedback. This happened, lather, rinse, repeat over several planning board meetings through September and October. 19 different options we tested, variants of option 1, which again you'll see in a moment. There were some really fine-tuned refinements of option 1N. That's the one that we picked. And then finally, there's the version that's on your warrant. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but there's 30 different options, and I want to walk through a high level kind of look at those 30 options, just so that you can have an understanding and I would say an assurance that we turned over a lot of different stones, trying to get to the zoning that you have in your warrant, for Monday. So there's fundamental challenges that we encountered, and they were kind of based on tensions between the compliance requirements and those guiding principles that I identified earlier. So one of the primary challenges that we encountered was the requirement to include at least half of our unit capacity and at least half of our minimum land area in the transit area, and to also have a contiguous subdistrict that represented half of the unit capacity. All right. That's a very kind of complicated set of terms that I just used. But what it all boils down to is we need to zone at least a portion of the single family neighborhood along Elliott Street. It's something that, we explored early on, and, you'll see that in a minute. We made a move towards, can we avoid doing this? Rezoning single family neighborhoods. I think it's something that people are not terribly interested in. Can we avoid doing this? It's unavoidable. So that's a requirement that we have that really rubs up against the desire to preserve the physical character of the town and to disincentivize teardowns. And the way that we thread the needle is to require the lowest possible density in the Elliott Street corridor. So that's 3 units per parcel. It's the lowest that you can get and still be considered multifamily, which is a requirement under the law. So what happens there is that subdistrict is very big and has a very low overall density. 3 units per lot across the Elliott Street corridor doesn't get you to a very high density at all. And so in order to hit 15 units per acre for the entire set of subdistricts, that density needs to be made up by much higher density in other subdistricts. So I just want you to sort of keep that dynamic in your head as we start to go through the different options and the different kind of iterations that we've run through. So that fundamental tension that I just described limits the other type of subdistricts that we could zone. Okay, so I said we've got to find other subdistricts that will have a high density to make up for the low density of the transit area Elliott Street corridor, which we have to zone. So if we zoned large parcels to a sufficient density, they would generate too many units. All right, and just recall, density is just a kind of a division problem of total number of units divided by land area. All right. And if you've got a big 60-acre parcel and you want it to have a high overall density, you're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of units. So there's a lot of really big parcels out there that you would say, oh, that looks like it could be the size of a good zoning subdistrict. But in reality, it generates way too many units for us to be comfortable doing it. Because remember, one of the principles that we've been operating under is we don't want to overshoot the minimum requirements, because of all sorts of reasons, fiscal impacts, traffic impacts, environmental impacts. So we want to keep as close to that 2461 as we can. If we zone many small parcels, we run into the same problem that we're seeing in Elliott Street, where Elliott Street is a ton of small little parcels that are rezoned to a very low density. So we couldn't just go to any other single family neighborhood in town and say, okay, we're going to zone Indian Cliffs or Brush Hill Road or, this part of Blue Hill Ave. And we're going to create another subdistrict because we encounter the same problem. And if you want to have a high enough density to make up for Elliott Street, then you are zoning for many more than 3 units per parcel. You're risking teardowns. You're risking out of character apartment buildings in the single family neighborhoods. And so the small parcels are out, the big parcels are out. It's those mid-sized parcels between half an acre, 1 acre, 5 acres, up to 8 acres is one of the largest parcels that we have. And these are the parcels where you can zone for what we would consider to be kind of a standard apartment building, 88 Wharf, 131 Elliott Street, Milton Hill House. This is not a 3-unit, 3-family house. This isn't a high rise. This is kind of your kind of standard apartment building. That happens on those parcels, half acre, 1 acre, 2 acres, maybe you have a small kind of complex on a larger parcel where you can get significant density on a parcel by parcel basis without zoning for thousands of units. Again, 131 Elliott Street is an example. That's a 1 acre parcel. We zoned for 40 units on it. That's, it seems like a lot for one parcel, but it's less than, the 800 units that we would potentially get on one of the Fuller Village parcels, which we tested. So that's why we sort of picked the subdistricts that we picked, because it's where those kind of mid-sized parcels are. They tend to be either commercial in nature or non-residential in some way. And then those parcels also are consistent with our other guiding principles, which again, we can refer back to those later. So this is one of the first tests that we did back in May, where we took the entire half-mile area around the transit stations and divided it into two subdistricts. And those correspond roughly to the residence C zone with kind of small parcels, and then the residence A and B zones within a half-mile, which are kind of larger kind of parcels. And the test that we did is in transit subdistrict A, which is the small parcels, 3 units per lot, 5,000 square foot minimum lot size. In the bigger transit area subdistrict, 4 units per lot with a 10,000 square foot minimum lot size. Those are the very simple parameters that we put in. We also zoned generally in the Granite Ave parcels and generally in the East Milton Square parcels. And what that leads to, and if you look at the unit capacity and the model density columns, 4,600 units, but only coming out to an overall density of 8.3 units per acre. And you can see that dynamic that I just described when you look at those transit area subdistricts. 7.7 units per acre in the entire C zone within a half-mile of transit, and then 3.3 units per acre in the entire A and B zone within a half-mile of transit. So this is the problem that we've been chasing since May and even before then, is we have to zone within the transit area. That leads to an overall density that is too low. We need to raise that up. And you can see, even zoning in Granite Ave and East Milton, to a model density of 35 and 46 units per acre, respectively, only gets you up to 8.3 units per acre. So this kind of set the table for that fundamental problem that we have been trying to solve for the past 8 or 9 months. We also tested some other larger parcels. So, we tested Granite Ave again. We tested parcels on Randolph Ave down in the southern part of town, the A. Thomas and Sons landscaping property. Plus, there's a parcel kind of in the Blue Hills that's owned by the Animal Rescue League. That's a kind of 14-acre kind of sub-district. We tested all of the Fuller Village parcels, plus the Brush Hill Rehabilitation Center down on Brush Hill Road. And then we tested, Transit Subdistrict 3 and Transit Subdistrict 4 is Milton Village Central Ave is 3, Unquity House is 4. So that was the first time that we tested those subdistricts. And you can start to see the dynamic with these subdistricts where when you look at the model district density, we get to something that's way over the 15 unit per acre requirement, with some really simple density requirements and other dimensional parameters. We're at almost 24 units per acre, which is, again, way overshooting our minimum density. So we'd want to try to bring that down somehow. The trouble is we're not really overshooting the overall model capacity by that much. And so you find yourself in a situation where, I'll have you, look at the Brush Hill Road subdistrict, right? That's 60 something acres. And at a 22 unit per acre density, we get 1,300 units down there, which is way, way too many for that skinny portion of Brush Hill Road, down by Fowl Meadow. So if you wanted to reduce that Brush Hill Road subdistrict, say by half, now you're under our minimum requirement of 2461 of unit capacity. So this taught us a lot about some of those larger parcels. We learned a lot about the smaller parcels in the first test, and we started to kind of zero in on some subdistricts. So we had tested, like I mentioned, that Randolph Ave South, kind of down by Chickatawbut Road. We tested that. Like I said, we tested Brush Hill Road. We also tested where the 728 Randolph Ave 40B is going to go near the access road. All of those kind of suffered from a lot of the same, problems in terms of, not being consistent with those guiding principles that we said. So, again, discussions at the planning board over the course of those months. We agreed on the 23rd at a planning board meeting. Let's stick with those sub districts kind of in the northern part of town. So I mentioned the fundamental options. So after all of that feedback and all of the things that we learned about the large parcels and the small parcels, our technical assistance consultant came up with these two options. Option one included East Milton Square. So we've got the Granite Ave subdistrict, Mattapan Station, Milton Station, the transit area, Elliott Street corridor, and East Milton Square. And then there's an option without East Milton Square, because we had been talking for a time about like, well, we've got this other zoning effort going on. Do we want to zone for East Milton Square under MBTA communities? It's an open question. So option two didn't include East Milton Square, put in those Randolph Ave, sub-districts at the access road and then down by Chickatawbut Road. And so these were sort of like the two options that, based on all the input we got from the planning board, based on our kind of evaluation of those fundamental principles, these are the two sets of sub-districts and the two options that kind of fit best. And you can see what it comes up with, and I won't talk about the dimensional parameters that went in here, but kind of this was like the starting point of like, okay, now thing is starting to take shape. So option one was chosen, and the idea there was, again, we've been talking about rezoning East Milton Square for a long time. It's something we want to do. We're going to get multifamily in East Milton Square at some point through a community-led rezoning process. So why not get credit for that under MBTA communities? We want to do what we want to do in East Milton, but we also want to get those units under MBTA communities. And so for that and for a number of other reasons, we started to pursue option one. So once we've got option one, we've got 19 other options that we iterated on over the course of September and October of 2023. And, we're not going to go through every single one of these, but these are sort of just descriptions of, different ways we kind of looked at some of these sub-districts, and some of them wound up not being compliant. And so we didn't talk about them too much, but I just wanted to share the slide just to underscore that, a lot of thought went into getting to option one, and then a lot more thought got into how do we fine tune option one to work best for us. This is another set of slides that I'm going to, quite frankly, blow through with some speed, but I wanted to share them just to, again, show that, over the course of, again, several months, the iterative process that we used was our consultants would present options to the planning board. We would discuss those at the planning board, provide feedback and kind of homework assignments to our consultants, and they would go back and work with the compliance model and work with the map and try to figure out a way to kind of fit in, that planning board feedback into parameters and districts that worked. So, this is just a summary of the feedback that our consultants got at the August 24th planning board meeting. They went on to get further feedback at the September 7th planning board meeting about all the different sub-districts and the different dimensional parameters. More feedback at the September 14th planning board meeting, about how to refine these sub-districts. September 28th, we had another planning board meeting, where additional refinements kind of went into, this option one. And then finally, we kind of settled on 1N. And you'll see some slides that are labeled 1N. That's just the sort of the version that kind of we fell on. And the refinement of option 1N happened, over the course of October. And you can see, just the three examples of, further iterations on this one option that we kind of landed on. And so again, just to underscore, 30 different iterations, based on our work with the constraints in the law and the guidelines, and then again, those internal constraints that we place upon ourselves via our kind of planning priorities, and just all of this feedback that the planning board gave to our technical assistance consultants to shape these districts and to kind of, shape the dimensional parameters, within them that make them what they are. So, there's been a ton of work that's gone into this, and it kind of, it just shows how much input, and back and forth there was between the planning board and our technical assistant consultants. So one thing that's been kind of working in parallel to the effort to actually create the zoning and create the zoning map is a fiscal impact analysis that the planning board commissioned earlier this year. We put out a solicitation for quotes, and a firm called RKG Associates kind of responded to our request for quotes to perform a fiscal impact analysis for MBTA community zoning. And what the fiscal impact analysis basically is like, you know, you often see these on a project basis where like, okay, we've got a project and it's going to build 200 units, in this part of town. What's going to be the impact on traffic? What's going to be the impact on infrastructure? What's going to be the impact on schools? How much is it going to cost to serve this new project and its residents, weighed against how much new property tax and other revenue is it going to generate as a project in the town. So RKG looked at department budgets, police, fire, public works, schools, general government, to determine the costs that are likely to increase with the addition of a new household, right? So the way that you do these fiscal impact analysis is not just like, all right, here's the town budget, here's the population, you divide one by the other, and every new resident, has to pay X number of dollars. That's not how it works. You have to identify where there are things in town that if there's one extra household or X number of extra households, these costs will increase. School-age children is a good example. Once you reach a certain number of new school-age children in town, you got to hire a new teacher, or find a new classroom space. These are the types of costs that kind of escalate as your population and number of households increases. So we want to know what is going to be the impact of the zoning at different levels of build out. I mentioned earlier, and I've mentioned a number of times throughout this presentation, that the unit capacity number of 2461 is not a realistic build out number. We will never see 2461 new units out of the zoning. It's just impossible. So that's not a realistic build out number. Although RKG did test a full build out situation just to provide a baseline, for analysis. But in order to figure out a realistic build out scenario where it's like, what can we actually expect under this zoning? They performed what they call a rate of change analysis, that kind of tries to estimate which parcels were most likely to be redeveloped. And I'm not going to speak for RKG entirely. If you go to that townofmilton.org/MBTA, we did post a recording of the planning board meeting on Tuesday, where our consultant from RKG presented his findings, has a really good explanation of what went into this, a really good conversation with the planning board. And then that summary document of the fiscal impact analysis is also there on that website. But I just want to walk you through it a tiny, tiny bit. So this rate of change methodology basically is trying to figure out what are the values of land in Milton and what are the kind of development parameters, what can be built under this new zoning, and basically where are there parcels where the land value is low enough for a developer to purchase that land and develop it and make a certain return. The assumption in this methodology is an internal rate of return of 15%. And so, the way that kind of real estate economics works is, land cost is always a kind of a really big factor in development costs. And if the land is too expensive, you're not able to make a return on your investment. And so that parcel likely goes undeveloped. Now, where the land value is relatively low compared to the development potential that the new zoning gives, then there's a difference, and that's a parcel that is more likely to be redeveloped because a developer can purchase it, redevelop it, all the costs that go into construction and labor and soft costs and all of that, still kind of, you make a return and there's a profit margin there. And so the way that RKG does this is they kind of back into this via assessed values. That's the most consistent. We don't have kind of market values for every single parcel, but we do have an assessed value. And so that's kind of the baseline that they use to kind of develop this rate of change analysis. Now, the rate of change analysis is kind of inherently conservative because it uses assessed value. If you've ever bought or sold a house in the town of Milton, you know that the market value of a piece of property is often more than the assessed value. But we use assessed value because it's kind of consistent, and we have that number for every parcel. And so that becomes much more than unit capacity or net new units, which is kind of just a factor of taking the unit capacity of a subdistrict and subtracting the number of existing housing units. And that's kind of, the new units that you can expect in a district. Both of those are kind of based on the kind of faulty premise of imagining that every single parcel in the subdistrict gets redeveloped. This is a methodology that, take it or leave it, it is much more rooted in realistic kind of real estate dynamics and presents a better picture of what we can expect. Although even then, I've got some notes that I want to share about what we can expect. So this is a chart that just shows one of the scenarios that RKG modeled, and they modeled three scenarios. One of them was for full build out. So what happens if every single parcel gets redeveloped for the total number of 25 something unit capacity under our current zoning parameters. They did another rate of change model for assuming that again using this rate of change, and then also assuming that we didn't require any parking. Because we're using parking maximums, there is the potential that certain developments may not build parking, depending on where they are. We expect that there will be some parking built, but this again is kind of an inherently conservative model based on the rate of change, because it assumes that no parking is going to get built. There will be parking that gets built, and the reason why that's a factor is because parking costs money to build, and so it kind of reduces that internal rate of return figure, and so there may be some parcels that fall out of development potential as a result. And it also kind of reduces the amount of land area that you have to actually build units, and so that can kind of affect things. But you can sort of look at all of the different subdistricts, and you can see this estimation under this rate of change model of like, what can we actually expect? And a great example right now is Granite Avenue North, 2 Granite Ave, where the Flatley building is. Right now, the value of that land is still too great for a developer to come in, purchase it, develop what is allowed to be developed under the zoning, and still make that 15% internal rate of return. And so this model is assuming that no units are going to be built on Granite Ave North. You also see in the Elliott Street corridor no units being projected under this rate of change model, because again, are you going to buy a $750,000, $800,000 Elliott Street parcel only to build 3 additional units, or in fact 2 additional units because there's already 1 unit there? From a real estate perspective, that it just doesn't pencil out, and so you're drawing zeros on Elliott Street. Milton Station East and West, you start to see some development potential. Blue Hills Parkway corridor, development potential. East Milton Square, some, but not nearly as much as the unit capacity. A couple notes I want to kind of share before we move on to the actual kind of money results is I think you'll probably see more than 0 units developed on Elliott Street, because what this is assuming is that a developer is going to come in and buy a house and redevelop. And what we actually expect to happen on Elliott Street is more existing homeowners doing the redevelopment. And it might not be for 3 units. It might just be you own a 1-family house and you want to put an extra unit, in the attic, in the basement, in an addition. You can do that under the zoning. And this model is not taking that type of behavior into account, because that's not a kind of a real estate speculation transaction. That is I'm a personal homeowner. I want my mother-in-law to move in, or I want to rent out some space in my house, yada, yada, yada. So I suspect we'll see more than 0 total units on Elliott Street, but again, not nearly as many as the unit capacity estimation. And then on Granite Avenue South, where you have the American Legion Hall and the State DPW yard, has the full unit capacity being projected to be built under this rate of change model. And I think this is where it's important to understand what's going into this rate of change model, which is, again, based fundamentally on the assessed value. And the assessed value kind of goes into a land value cost compared to the development potential of the parcel itself. Now, one thing to understand about Granite Avenue South is the American Legion Hall, which, as far as I know, is a nonprofit use. And frankly, even though it's nonprofit, still has value, but not the same value as if it had a multifamily or commercial building on it. And then the northern part of Granite Avenue South is the state DPW yard and park and ride lot in very, very, very low value uses. And so the assessed value for those parcels is extremely low compared to the size of those parcels and the development potential of those parcels. So this model is assuming that those are going to get built, but there are other factors, as I said very early on, that go into how does a parcel get redeveloped. And one of them is it's state property. And the state has to go through an extremely onerous process to dispose of property and redevelop it under any circumstance. To say nothing of the fact that it also has really critical MassDOT uses on it as sort of a kind of a staging area for emergency and kind of weather operations between the Braintree split and downtown. And so, again, this model says that we can expect full build out at Granite Avenue South. What I'm saying is when you look at the full picture, it's not as sure a bet. That's a lot of framing. So let's move on to the next slide, where what these models show is under the three scenarios that RKG tested, full build out. So again, assuming every single unit under our unit capacity calculation is built, the rate of change model that assumes no parking, and then the rate of change model that assumes that some parking will be built. Under every single one of these development scenarios, the MBTA community's zoning is a revenue generator for the town under the parameters of the model. And again, understand that what the model is trying to calculate is, in terms of costs and expenses, what are the costs that rise when new households enter the town? And those are the costs. And then the revenue is the tax revenue, and then there's excise tax and other kind of property taxes. In every single circumstance, we are generating revenue for the town. So we've got a methodology here that well, what about OPEB? What about pension costs? There's all sorts of reasons why certain of these numbers are not included in this model. Employee health costs, are not necessarily tied to households. Those are tied to all sorts of other factors in kind of the healthcare system. So they don't get factored in this model. So, I don't want to tell you that if we do MBTA communities under the rate of change model that we're going to make $400,000 a year. What this is meant to show is that multifamily housing does not have nearly the amount of expense on municipal impacts as people think intuitively. And so this is one of the values of this fiscal impact analysis. And we've given this to all of our department heads to look at to see if it comports with their understanding of kind of how their budgets work. But we were very pleased with the results of this. So another kind of genre of question that we've gotten is, well, what about infrastructure? When you build, new housing, there's going to be an impact on water and on sewer and on the roads. Who's responsible for new infrastructure when we build new projects in the town? So the first things first is one of the virtues of zoning for infill development, which is, developing where, there actually is already stuff instead of developing out in the middle of the woods, is that new units are built where roadway, transit, water, and sewer capacity already exists. Okay. We have pipes in Elliott Street. We've got pipes in Granite Ave. We've got pipes all over. They have capacity. We don't have pipes in a lot of the more kind of sparsely developed parts of town. We don't have, obviously, transit capacity. The roads are smaller. So one of the virtues of zoning where we are zoning in those transit and amenity-rich areas is that there's already infrastructure that we can take advantage of. But furthermore, The compliance guidelines state very explicitly, compliance with Section 3A does not require a municipality to install new water or wastewater infrastructure or add to the capacity of existing infrastructure to accommodate future multifamily housing production within the multifamily zoning district. So we are not required to do anything. We're required to pass the zoning. That's it. Furthermore, from Section 3.2 of the town sewer regulations, and I'll just read these, verbatim. The director, this is the DPW director, may require an evaluation of a proposed sewer connection performed by a Massachusetts registered professional engineer to assess the impact of the additional flow would have on the public sewer. The cost of said evaluation shall be borne by the applicant. A permit application may be denied if the additional flow is determined to have adverse effect on the public sewer. What this means is every time we have a major project that is being proposed in town, we require the applicant to evaluate the capacity of the sewer to handle the discharge that's coming off of that project. And if there's capacity, great. If there's not, then the applicant has two choices. You either don't get your permit because the DPW director says additional flow is going to have an adverse effect on the public sewer, whether it's from capacity restrictions or there's a manhole that's kind of leaky or, whatever. You're not going to get your permit because your flow is going to adversely affect the entire system. Or you can upgrade the system so that the problem goes away. And we see this all the time with large projects in the town of Milton. And this is directly in our sewer regulations. Additionally, every sewer permit requires what's called an inflow and infiltration fee. I&I is what we call it. So that means that new connections are required to remove 4 gallons of I&I for every 1 gallon they add to the system, or pay a fee that allows the town to do that itself. Inflow and infiltration is basically if a sewer pipe has a crack in it and you're getting groundwater in the sewer pipe. Sewer pipe is really meant to just take wastewater from a building out to Deer Island, right? And if you've got groundwater seeping into the system, now we've got non-wastewater in our pipe, and it affects the capacity, it affects the integrity of the system. If there are illegal connections or faulty connections somewhere, that also has I&I restrictions. So DPW is constantly using these I&I funds to go throughout the system to fix these leaky pipes and address these illegal connections or faulty connections. And so it's a 4-to-1 ratio of I&I improvement for every project. It improves efficiency, not just for the project itself, but for everybody in town. So, sewer infrastructure is covered in that way. This is from Section 4.2 of the town's water regulations, and particularly the section on fire services. So this is every multifamily building is going to have fire services, whether it's a standpipe or sprinklers or whatever kind of separated system is going to be needed to fight fires on a multifamily project. Prior to construction, the owner shall conduct a hydrant flow test to determine the available volume and pressure at the location of the fire service. The test shall be conducted by an independent testing agency and scheduled in advance with the department. The owner shall be responsible for all charges related to the flow test and shall submit a flow test report as part of the application. Now, what this flow test is about is these buildings need to have sufficient capacity for the fire department to hook up a fire hose and blast a fire hose of water at a fire in this building. Now, I don't want to sound flip or simplistic, but the amount of water you need to run a fire hose is far in excess of the amount of water you need to fill your tub or your spaghetti pot or take a shower. And so by requiring that, I'll use the term excessive. It's not excessive for fighting a fire. It's important, but for having adequate flow to fight a fire, that necessarily means that there is enough capacity, more than enough capacity for domestic needs. And so again, this is another situation where if you don't have, if your project isn't able to demonstrate that there's capacity for fire safety, then you've got those two options. You don't get the permit to make the connection, or you improve the capacity so that you can meet this requirement in our regulations. So this is something people are very concerned about. But again, infrastructure that in almost every case is going to be covered by the developer of the project if there are capacity or other issues. So this has been a long presentation. I appreciate everyone's patience. But just to wrap up, Articles 1 and 2, more than 9 months of really in-depth discussion about dimensional parameters, zoning boundaries, review procedures, more than a year of kind of general discussion about MBTA communities and the compliance guidelines. The development of these subdistricts and the zoning language, as I said, were guided by principles that weren't just made up out of thin air, but were drawn from previous planning efforts, the master plan, the housing production plan, the report of the Equity and Justice for All Committee, other planning processes that we've had, input from residents and from other elected officials. We were also constrained by the requirements of the statute and the compliance guidelines, which I hope became clear throughout some of the more boring parts of this presentation. So there's many potential paths to compliance. I said we did 30 different iterations. Half of those were compliant. So there's more than 15 options out there if you wanted to pick one. But most of those didn't pass the test of meeting those guiding principles that we have for ourselves. And so getting to the final outcome on the warrant was an exercise in trade-offs and prioritizing those competing planning priorities. How do you reconcile compliance with preserving the physical character of the neighborhood? How do you reconcile, taking advantage of existing multifamily with, being in transit and amenity-rich areas? It's a real kind of, battle of competing priorities. So, 30 iterations, 9 months of work. Any other potential subdistricts that we can think of and any other kind of alternative zoning maps or zoning plans are going to wrestle with the same issues that this article has wrestled with. And other potential subdistricts, at least we have found, aren't meeting as many of the guiding principles that we have as the subdistricts and the dimensional parameters that you see in Article 1. And so for those reasons, we think that Article 1 represents the best combination of compliance and adherence to the town's planning priorities. So we're just about ready to start the question and comment period. As I mentioned earlier, hit the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. You'll be entered into a queue. We'll take that queue in order. If you're on the phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. And then when you're called upon, you can unmute yourself by pressing *6. And again, there is no Q&A function, unfortunately, tonight. So all of the questions and comments are going to come via the raise hand function. So thanks again for your patience. I hope this was informative for everybody. I'm going to stop sharing right now, but we can bring this presentation back up for anyone that wants to see anything more specifically. So again, thanks again. 8:30. Oh goodness, I really thought I could get this done in under an hour. I'm sorry. But I wanted to make sure that we walk through that stuff in as great as detail as possible, for all of you. So again, appreciate your patience, appreciate your attention. And if anyone has any questions, let's do it. I'm not seeing any hands raised, Josh, are you?
No, sir. I think maybe the completeness was, oh no, we've got Forbes Sargent. Forbes.
Thank you, Forbes. And if you could just mention your precinct for the crowd.
Sure, thanks, Tim. And Forbes Sargent, Precinct 3. I live next door to the Milton Hill House, for context, which you can imagine I'm a little concerned about the new numbers. So I have a whole bunch of questions. The first question that popped into my mind was, we just rezoned Adam Street in Milton Village, right? So that included multifamily housing with stores on the first floor as an added incentive. So why was that not included?
So one of the things that, if you look at the map of our MBTA communities districts and sort of compare that to the map of the Milton Village overlay, what we tried to do, and you know, I talked about kind of the dynamic of, you know, really big parcels and really small parcels. Um, and the Milton Village zoning was really kind of targeted towards, I mean, obviously targeted towards some of the bigger parcels, you know, but like really, you know, those Adams Street and High Street parcels really were targeted in that zoning to create, you know, mixed use that, you know, worked on those parcels. And for a couple reasons, you know, one of which, avoiding the historic district as much as we could. You know, we did rezone portions of Milton Village, obviously, but also kind of getting into a situation where could we create dimensional parameters on those really, really tiny High Street and sort of smallish, but you know, but bigger Adam Street lots that would not result in teardowns. And that became really difficult. So again, rather than do something that would imperil that historic district and those existing buildings, we just kind of avoided zoning that altogether. And so that was, you know, we did talk about that. But again, it became really difficult to, and especially, and the other thing I'll say, Forbes, is because of the permitting structure of the Milton Village zoning is a special permit. So we can put a lot of really detailed restrictions and requirements in that zoning that you really can't do in a by right situation. You can put some development standards in by right zoning, but you really have to, you know, it takes away a lot of discretion that the planning board has. They've got some under site plan approval, but not nearly as much as they have under a special permit. And so the risk of those properties kind of losing that character that the Milton Village rezoning tried to preserve was too great to rezone over there.
Okay, thanks for that. And by the way, thank you for your presentation and talking for an hour and a half. I know that can't be easy.
I I wish it was shorter. I apologize for that.
The second question is, I'm concerned about the Milton Hill House because in your presentation doesn't show the actual number of units on the Milton Street Bridge, or the Milton Bridge, which is the Milton Hill House. But I've seen other models where there are 117 new units for the Milton Hill House lot, if you will. And I know that the FAR is there, and I know that the FAR of 1 is actually higher than some of the other areas like East Milton, where I think it's 0.7. But my concern is that the Milton Hill House is the one area that is so easily developable because there's one owner, they own the lot, excuse me, they don't have to put any parcels together. They just have to go out and build it. And right now, as you point out, the reason the Milton Hill House is there is because of a special permit from 19 something or other. So what we have is we've got a situation where it's much easier for the Milton Hill House to now go and build it. And the building is itself is probably 50 feet away from my house and 60 feet away from my neighbor's house. And the neighbors on Morton Terrace, whole bunch of areas. But it's concerning to me that we've lost our leverage against them. When they built the new houses down on Elliott Street, we were able to ask them, and they conceded to putting up new gates, new landscaping, setbacks. We had a whole bunch of leverage, which we'll lose now. And I guess the same question sort of applies for the Milton Hill House as it would for Adams Street, which is how do we protect that with such a large zoning increase?
So I mean, you mentioned leverage, and I think it's a good frame to kind of talk about, you know, not just that parcel, but the exercise itself. And when I say the exercise itself, I mean MBTA communities, the law, you know, for this region, and kind of not to take it out of, you know, into too much of a broad perspective, but I mean the reason why the law was passed is because there are a lot of towns like Milton, you know, we're not getting picked on. You know, Newton is the same way, Brookline's the same way, Wellesley, Weston. have not been building multifamily housing commensurate with the regional need for housing. And so we've lost leverage. People talk about 40B and like, is this akin to 40B? It's very different from 40B, but it's the same in the sense that the law was passed because the Commonwealth saw that individual municipalities exercising local control were not building the housing that the region needs. And so some of that local control gets taken away. And so in the form of 40B, it's developer can come in and do whatever they want if they do affordable housing. In the form of MBTA communities, it's you lose control over your ability to zone certain areas of your town. So, it's true, we have lost that leverage. A by right zoning scheme is different from a special permit zoning scheme. Now, again, what we've tried to do is set those zoning parameters so that they mirror the existing conditions as closely as possible. But we also have to weigh that against, we've got to hit a unit capacity number. And we've got to, where we've got multifamily housing, we need to try to rezone it. And some of those parcels, I mean, the new building is probably not going to get redeveloped anytime soon. The old building is more likely for redevelopment than the one next door. So, I don't have a great answer except to say that, we still have site plan approval. We have set dimensional parameters that, while not as stringent as they could be under a special permit, are still really powerful tools to kind of shape the size and kind of configuration of that development. And one thing I'll say about the unit capacity number that comes out of the compliance model is that all that is doing is really kind of, it's making a lot of assumptions about a lot of things. And so it takes the parcel size and it takes certain of the dimensional parameters that you input into it, open space, parking, overall density, 40 units per acre or whatever we put in there. I think it was 40. Height, depending on how many stories you can have, and kind of generates, based on an assumed unit size, how many units you can put, on there. It doesn't take into account, the setbacks, for instance. It doesn't take into account, other site-based restrictions in terms of either topography or other kind of, on the ground conditions that may affect. So whatever the number is for that parcel is kind of the number that the model generates. It's not necessarily the exact number that a developer or an owner would build under the conditions that exist on the site, combined with some of the other restrictions we've put in. So, again, to kind of get back to your question, we have lost leverage over some of these parcels. That's just more of a function of the law than it is anything else. I think it's a valid question. I think it's, it's a valid concern, but we've done as much as we can to make sure that anything that gets developed on these properties, is not so out of character based on kind of what's already there. Forbes, I appreciate both of your questions. I'm going to ask, we've got a couple people behind you, so I'm going to lower your hand, but if you've got more questions, you can get to the back of the line if you're interested. So thank you for those. We've got Brian Kelly next.
Thank you. Well, it's funny that Forbes mentioned the situation over at the Milton Hill House. As you did a lot of work, and I'm glad I didn't have to do it. I can't say that I'm particularly pleased. I'm a town meeting member in Precinct 7, and the people on Thistle Ave are going to really be taking the brunt of this. You talk about it being a mostly state-owned property, and how they're going to need to still maintain Route 3 down to the split. Well, the governor is also really for this law and for developing 200,000 housing units. So there's one owner, it's the governor. This marks all the boxes, checks all the boxes. And from what I see, the easiest place to develop, and probably the first place to get developed, would be Granite Ave South. And it's just unfortunate. We've got multiple 40Bs going up in East Milton Square, and now we're getting them a little further south. And our whole community is between those two. The traffic on Granite Ave to get to the expressway is horrendous. we're taking the density of the whole program. The houses on Elliott Street probably won't get developed, as you said, well, because the green building codes are a lot more expensive on new construction now. So anyone that raises their house and puts a new 3-unit in is going to have a lot more expensive building cost. And so we have to take the density to make those numbers work over there. We take the affordable housing numbers here. We take low parking. If we go with low parking, I can't see anyone parking on Granite Ave. And so they'll have to go across the street and be parking on the streets in the Thistle Street neighborhood. They can't even get out of their place in the morning because of the traffic going on the expressway. Now, I'm not saying I blame you for picking that spot, okay? It's just unfortunate that that's working totally against East Milton. We're going to take the brunt of all the new units that this law goes in place for many years. I don't see anything happened down at Milton Landing with a beautiful condo down there. The new Henry site, obviously. Why didn't you just give a little more zoning for the Henry site so we could get more credit there? Because they're still not going to tear it down. We could have taken more credit for it, but it's just it's unfortunate. I don't see any good in this for East Milton, and I'm very disappointed because I don't see other development happening really fast. I think we should actually, and to tell those people in Granite Ave to take the T, and that's out of the T zone. Do you ever try to walk from the parcel from the Granite South across the bridge, down the walkway to one of the stations over, or like Butler Station or something like that? They would freeze to death, okay? And it's really not really walkable to East Milton. That's a cold street to walk on with the water down the street. So it's not all that great. It doesn't really touch all those boxes that you were talking about. I think it touches the fact that you can put the density in there. It's undeveloped already. You can get it. And I get it. I understand it. I'm not saying I wouldn't do the same thing, but it's my neighborhood and it's a different story then. So thank you for your time. I appreciate you listening. And,
Yeah, no, and Brian, thank you for those comments. And I muted myself. We've heard a lot, of commentary from folks on Cortlandt Circle and Thistle and Riverside, and obviously folks in East Milton. And Granite Ave is one of the sort of sub districts that kind of on its face, doesn't look like it fits the bill as much as others, although portions, the 2 Granite Ave parcel is in the Cedar Grove catchment area, so we do get credit for transit area units over there. I take your point. Folks may not walk over the bridge to Cedar Grove, but there's a couple really nuanced things about Granite Ave that make us a little bit more confident that any development that happens there is kind of better than some of the worst case scenarios that people are imagining. I think first of all, that state DPW yard park and ride lot has been previously kind of marked for disposition. You might remember back in 2013, 2014, the town commissioned a Granite Ave study committee, because there was serious overtures from the state that they wanted to dispose of the park and ride lot. And what kind of development would the town be interested in seeing there? And it's really important to note that they were only floating the park and ride lot because the uses on the northern part, the salt shed and the maintenance yard and everything, were really the critical uses. And so the reason that we are able to zone that state property, because otherwise you're really not allowed to zone public property, state, federal, local, or whatever, is if the site is mentioned as a strategic housing site in a state-approved housing production plan, which we have, and which we said it'd be really great to put some housing on the state DPW yard and park and ride lot. And so now we get to zone that. And so this is another situation where, similar to, Hendry's or 88 Wharf, where redevelopment not very likely, but we get credit for units. There are units that are being generated by that maintenance yard, salt shed kind of portion that, again, I understand that the governor is really interested in developing housing, but we've already seen in different, scenarios where we want to get rid of this land, but not all of it. And so, we're still believers in the fact that a good portion of that site is still kind of critical transportation infrastructure for the Commonwealth and would not be, put up for disposition or redevelopment. Now, the other thing that's really important to know about the Granite Ave site is, almost every one of these other parcels is going to be subject to, developer wants to develop it or a property owner wants to develop it. They go to get their building permit, they get kicked to the planning board for site plan approval, and all we've got is what's in the zoning. All right. And we've tried to put as much as we can in the zoning, but it's still a by right process and people can build what they want to build. And, we can put reasonable conditions on, but, we don't have a ton of leverage in a by right situation. When the state is disposing of land, and you see this time and time again in different communities, whether it's residential or industrial or commercial uses, they are a much more collaborative partner on these types of things than a private developer of a private piece of property would be in terms of developing that RFP. And we have direct experience with this, again, back in 2013, 2014, where there were overtures over, hey, we're thinking of disposing of this. The town commissioned studies. We hired an engineering firm to evaluate different, scenarios. We put together a group of residents to kind of give the Commonwealth an idea of like, this is the type of uses that we think would be acceptable here. It's a situation where we would have a lot more of a seat at the table with the Commonwealth as a partner in a development project than a private developer just utilizing the zoning. The zoning is what it is. We think it's good. We think it offers a lot of protections, but it is what it is. And if there's a lot of units on a parcel, there's not a ton that can be done, if the zoning allows that. With the state parcel, they're not necessarily going to just look at the zoning and do what the zoning says. They're going to sit down and kind of, help us figure it out. The other thing about Granite Ave is every other regulation, zoning, or otherwise that we have still applies in these districts. So it's in the flood zone. So we have a flood zone overlay that requires you to raise up a portion of your site so that your project is not affected by the design flood elevation is how they refer to it. That eats into your height. So if you're allowed 45 feet, that's not 45 feet above the flood zone. That's 45 feet from the ground. All right. And so that's a natural limitation on the amount that can be developed that the compliance model is not taking into account when it spits out a number on unit capacity. The final thing that I want to say about Granite Ave is Granite Ave in that part of town is a state road, right? Just like Randolph Ave, just like 138. And so in order to do a development on a state road, you need a MassDOT access permit. And it's MassDOT property, it's a MassDOT road, they're going to have to get a permit from themselves, but there's all sorts of procedures that go into that MassDOT access permit where you've got to evaluate how many cars are coming on, how many cars are coming off, where is your driveway going to be, how does it affect the existing traffic, how does it affect the existing intersections. In 2017, MassDOT conducted a road safety audit on this portion of Granite Ave that recommended a whole laundry list of improvements for pedestrian access, bicyclist access, people in their cars, crossings, signals, all sorts of proposals to kind of make that road a safer place. And the managing, the responsible agency for all of those things, because it's a MassDOT road, is MassDOT itself. MassDOT is not, we've seen this, they're not going to just make improvements out of the goodness of their heart, right? Development is what's going to drive those improvements to Granite Ave. So it's not just there's going to be a couple hundred units on the salt shed and traffic's going to be terrible. It's we're going to have a partner in developing an RFP, and also that partner is responsible for making critical transportation improvements that are going to enable that project to happen and not exacerbate things, but also are going to be the trigger for a lot of really important safety improvements that MassDOT itself has already identified as necessary. So these things don't get put into the compliance model, but they're things that we understand about those parcels and about that part of town. And I get it, right? I know I try to go by Granite Ave when I'm coming into the office as much as I can, so I can see those conditions in the morning and see them in the evening. I understand, but there's a little bit more to what's going on over there relative to our zoning than just what shows up in the compliance model. So Brian, unfortunately, I did a lot of talking there. So we're gonna put you at the back of the line. If you've got any other questions or comments, you can put your hand back up. But we're gonna move on to Kay Conroy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Kim Conroy. I'm precinct 7. First of all, Tim, thanks for doing this. I mean, again, this is, I think, the 4th meeting I've attended, and I know the work you've put into this. But my concerns are still very real, and they're really, as a town meeting member, these concerns are very real to my precinct and the East Milton community. Just looking at the fiscal model that you would put out, 62%, I think it was, of the end units would end up in East Milton, between East Milton Square and Granite Ave. And just looking at the equity of how the plug and play works and the minimum lot size, you know, I know part of the goal in this was preserving communities. And we talked, you mentioned a few times, single family communities and historic communities. But I just think it needs to be pointed out that East Milton is both. So yes, we do have multifamily housing, but the vast majority is single family. We are probably the most densely packed with school children in all of Milton, arguably. And we do have the Railroad District, which is a historic community, yet we're still taking the brunt of this. And I know that the overlay has come up, the East Milton overlay. I attended that meeting as well. But respectfully, we've been talking about that for, I think, about 14 years. I bought my house 14 years ago, and I know there's been more work done on it recently than in past. But the confidence level that this area of town is going to be protected at all in this is very concerning. And then the last piece of it is, I know you brought up infrastructure, but we're talking about how developers would own some of that. But East Milton just got zoned for, I don't know if zone's the right word, but we were building our new fire station. I believe it's only 1 fire truck. There was recently a very sad fire on Collimore, but it was a single family, smaller home in a relatively contained fire. But it took the trucks of 3 different fire stations to come and deal with the problem at hand. Meanwhile, the entire square was gridlocked. And I know that because I was trying to get home to make sure my family was safe. So I know these aren't questions per se, but they're very real concerns of myself and my neighbors. And if you can address any of them, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, no, certainly, and you know, I appreciate those comments. You know, just a couple things. You know, I've seen that 62% figure kind of in the discourse recently, and I think that's kind of a reference to not the fiscal impact analysis, which actually is anticipating far fewer units being built or in East Milton, but it is a reference to sort of the net new units between. You know, so that's the difference between the unit capacity number that comes out of the compliance model and sort of the existing, you know, residential units. And so, you know, as we said, if you've got, you know, if you've got 1 unit on a parcel already, it's zoned for 3 units. The net new units is 2 because there's already 1 there. So from like an impact perspective, you're only getting 2 units. So that's where that 62% number comes from. You know, where you know 62% of the net new units are in Granite Ave and East Milton Square, and I think, you know, when you think kind of critically about that, first of all, we're not, when we talk about sort of equity and fairness and where these sub-districts are kind of drawn up, you know, we're not necessarily looking at, well, you know, this part of town's getting this much and that part of town's getting that much, because, you know, that's a kind of a recipe for, let's just put zoning districts evenly dispersed in all sorts of, you know, neighborhoods. And then it kind of throws out the actual kind of planning priorities and kind of the really kind of nuanced analytical look at, you know, where is actually the appropriate places to put housing development. When we think about sort of fairness, we think about those guiding principles. And I think, you know, the historic district part is a good example. I know the East Milton residential neighborhood, a significant portion of it is the Railway Historic District. We are not zoning anywhere in the Railway Historic District. We are primarily rezoning in the Business District, which is not a part of the Historic District. Similarly, you know, we have a handful of parcels that are technically a part of the Milton Village Historic District, but otherwise have avoided rezoning in the significant portion of the Milton Village Historic District, and we are not zoning at all in the Milton Hill Historic District. So understanding that, we are rezoning near historic districts, there's almost no way around it. But we have done our level best to avoid rezoning the actual historic districts with contributing historic structures. East Milton's a great example. We took the Milton Arts Center out of the district. We took the post office out of the district. Those are two historic structures that are, contributing to the sort of architectural and historic heritage of the district. We didn't want to put any of them at risk, so we took them out. The sort of the skepticism about the zoning, I definitely understand. I know how long that this conversation has been going along. But we have a consultant right now, maybe not as we speak, but almost as we speak, starting the process of drafting zoning for East Milton. We had one community meeting already. We'll have several more. That is going to be subject to as much public discussion as is appropriate to get it to a level where we can take it to town meeting and confidently get a 2/3 vote at town meeting for that zoning. But we've been talking about it for a long time. We are actually writing zoning today. And so, I think this is part of where that notion of like, well, there's an unfair amount of kind of unit capacity in East Milton compared to other parts of town. And I think what that doesn't take into account is we've already been talking about rezoning for mixed use in East Milton. There are no, for the most part, residential units in the commercial district over there right now, which is why that net new unit figure is so high. We want there to be residential units. We don't know how many under the overlay zoning that we're drawing up, but we've always assumed that there's going to be mixed use development in East Milton at some point under zoning that we are doing our level best to create in a very sort of neighborhood oriented way. And so, MBTA communities kind of came out of left field for us, but I think it's a little bit disingenuous to argue that, well, the net new units is much greater because like there's no units there now, but we want there to be units. And so whether it's the 400 something that MBTA communities speculates on, or it's another number that we get under the zoning that we write, we want there to be those units there. And I think finally, that kind of, I do want to push back on that a little because the other thing that, kind of drives, what I think people are considering to be an unfairness is, there's already a lot of multifamily in the transit area, in Milton Village and the Central Avenue business district and near Mattapan Station. And so the reason why that net new figure is relatively low over there is because to the extent that there are impacts from multifamily housing, they've already been felt over there. And so, we get to take credit for those units with a relatively low net new units figure because the stuff already exists. I mentioned a lot of reasons why Granite Ave, why we think that the amount of development that's going to happen on Granite Ave is going to be less than what the unit capacity figure is. And we think the development will be better than just a simple kind of extruded mass of 500 units. I think the same thing for East Milton. In the worst case scenario for East Milton, we are zoning for less height than is already allowed under the business district zoning. We are zoning for more open space, more setbacks than exists under the business district zoning. So if someone wants to take advantage of the MBTA community zoning for East Milton, you are going to get very simple, small, really sort of minimally impactful developments. What our hope is, through the process of developing the overlay zoning, is that we put a lot more thought into a parcel by parcel analysis of what is the best type of development for the Brugger's building, what is the best type of development for the storefronts on Adams Street, and start to really tailor dimensional requirements that are going to achieve, the neighborhood's goals for the built environment over there. So I think it's a much more complicated and nuanced picture than just, the map with the unit capacity numbers. But and we're going to be in East Milton, for the better part of next year, talking to folks and trying to figure out, zoning that is going to work for them. But again, we've been talking about, building housing in there for a long time. And so, we want it to be there, and we want it to be under the zoning that we're kind of in the process of writing rather than the MBTA community zoning.
To be clear, I wasn't saying that we shouldn't take any of the zoning and we shouldn't take any of the units either. Like I'm fully
no,
in support of that. And I was using the scenarios for a fiscal model for the numbers and the percent I gave. It's just when you look at it, it's glaring, incredibly glaring again, when, previous residents have already said, we already have the two rather large 40Bs coming. We are in gridlock on a daily basis. So it's obviously a concern. And just one last question. If I know we have a deadline, which is obviously we want to be in compliance with the state, and that's something that's important to many people. Is there any possibility or likelihood of filing an extension if necessary? Is that something that's allowed?
So the planning board actually wrote a letter to the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, requesting an extension. I don't know. I think they might have asked for, like, I think a 6-month extension. I don't quote me on that.
Okay.
But we actually did just get a response this week from the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, and they basically said, we understand. Unfortunately, we're not in a position to grant individual extensions for a number of reasons. Rapid transit communities have this deadline for a reason. Other rapid transit communities have been able to reach their deadline. Other even adjacent communities, Arlington already passed zoning, Brookline already passed zoning. I think, for the sake of fairness to other communities that have already been out there doing this work, HLC is not going to give an extension. So, if we don't get the zoning done at a special town meeting in December, we can always, we'll have to go back to a future town meeting, but we will not be in compliance, and we kind of run the risk of the consequences of non-compliance.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much for those comments. And I didn't mean, I'm sorry if I pushed back a lot on that. It's just the first time I've had a chance to kind of talk in kind of detail about Granite Ave, East Milton. But we definitely appreciate those concerns. And again, we want to be out there in that zoning process, figuring out, zoning that you all want, as opposed to zoning that the state wants. We've got Chris Shirley next.
Hey, Tim, thanks for the time. I am a citizen, not a town meeting member. Are we citizen speak yet or no?
If you can keep it relatively short, that would be great, but you're in here, so go ahead.
Awesome. Just wanted to clarify some of those numbers that RKG delivered on Tuesday. It seems like I'm in precinct 7, by the way, on Cortlandt Circle. 477 and 59 in East Milton comes out to be 60% of market units in our area. So about 540 compared to 58 single family houses on Thistle and Cortlandt. So the 62% is net new. I know you discussed that already, but it seems like RKG is somewhat consistent with the market units in that number. So I just wanted to bring that up and make sure I was reading that right. And we've all talked about traffic. That's a concern. So I don't want to speak too much about that, but this isn't just a Cortlandt issue. It's not a Thistle issue. If you drive by our houses from the rest of town to get into Boston, it's your issue now. There's only 2 arteries to get onto the expressway, and it's Granite Ave and it's the Ponset Bridge. So I think those are 2 issues that traffic is going to be a huge issue for the entire town. And I just wanted to bring that up too. I think we just need more time on this. I know that we don't technically have it with a deadline, but it seems like the planning board is not in favor of this article by 4-1. The RKG report just came out on Tuesday, 2 days ago. That's the fiscal analysis that really nobody's had time to digest. It just seems like we need a little bit more time to make sure that we can get this right. And that's all my comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I mean, and you know, your read of those numbers is right. You know, and but you know, as I said, you know, there's some nuance to that rate of change, you know, model that RKG used. You know, that I think when you're talking about, you know, state property, you know, it operates on a different kind of you know, spectrum than private property when it comes to, you know, land value and you know, the state values its land differently than a private developer with the same amount of land would you know, would value it, or a private property owner. So you know, not to say that, you know, the assumption that 500 or 530 units, you know, will be built on Granite Ave South, not to say that that assumption is wrong, but to say that that parcel does not operate like, you know, as I mentioned, it's the state. They have different priorities. They have a different relationship with the town than a private owner does. And so, you know, for all the reasons I kind of discussed earlier, you know, I think that any development that happens over there is going to be, you know, less than the full 530 that's modeled. And I think the way that that development is going to happen is going to be, you know, a little bit more collaborative and frankly, a little bit more beneficial to the town, you know, relative to infrastructure improvements on Granite Ave. Traffic, you know, I live in the Ponset Circle, so I'm downstream. I'm downstream of all of it, so I get it. You know, this is a problem. That's a problem today. It was a problem yesterday. It's going to be a problem tomorrow. You know, a lot of that traffic is you know, again, people trying to get on the expressway, either cutting through or, you know, people from Milton, you know, coming in. I think, you know, Granite Ave is not the greatest transit area. You know, obviously there are, you know, places we're developing that are actually, you know, near train stations. But you know, the 215 bus that runs up Granite Ave is slated under the MBTA bus network redesign to actually get improved service between Quincy Center and Ashmont Station. So that is something where, you know, we're not counting on, you know, everyone in those developments, or at least a majority of people in those developments taking the bus. But that bus service is slated to improve. You know, we think it's a possibility compared to other sub districts in town where there is no train, no bus, it's just get in your car and go. You know, there's more of a likelihood that people are going to make use of either transit or, you know, getting on the bike trail right over there. You know, I don't want to overstate that case. I think people are going to want to use the expressway, so I get it. But again, you know, for all the reasons we talked about earlier, you know, I think that Granite Ave, you know, any projects that happen there are going to be better than what the model kind of speculates on. We've got Kristen next.
Thanks, Tim. So I just want to kind of echo, I guess, some of the things that we've already talked about. And one of the things that, you know, I don't want some of my fellow residents and the town meeting members to think that if they're not familiar with Granite, that, you know, some sort of traffic mitigation is going to help, because really what the traffic is an extension sort of the ramp to the traffic on the expressway is all backed up. And so as long as the traffic on the expressway is backed up, Granite Ave will be backed up. And that's essentially what's going on. There's nowhere else for that traffic to go. They're just sitting there waiting for their turn to get on the expressway. So they can do all kinds of, you know, we've seen the plans that they've offered, moving Granite further west into those lots so that they can, you know, give a dedicated lane for Cortland and Thistle so that we can at least get in and out. But there's no mitigation for that backup. And adding any number of units there is just going to make it more of a backup and add, you know, gridlock basically, because they're going to be cutting off, in order to get on the ramp, they'll be cutting off the southbound lane of Granite as well. So it'll become a complete snarl every day. So I just want to make sure that that's clear to people. And then in terms of the lot being a state lot and all, it's still kind of confusing. I think that, I mean, I know that it's owned by the state, or it's run by the state, but that was, before the expressway, part of the Neponset River Reservation, and it was conservation land run by MDC at the time and DCR now. And the highway department just they're there now using it. And I think that if the state decides that the highway department doesn't need to be there anymore, it needs to be returned to DCR and not built. And, I'm afraid of, setting some sort of making a statement to the state that we want to build on it, is, not a good message to send. And the other thing that I've noticed that I'm not sure that is clear to everybody, I know that, it's in the flood zone and all of that, but there is actually water flowing across those lots. And the Heritage Hall, that lot that you have mapped out, Heritage does not have that whole lot. It's only half of it, the paved part. There's actually still conservation land back there behind it. They were not deeded that entire area. So, I just, the whole thing disturbs me. And then, the previous caller mentioned the historic railroad. That is across those lots. And it goes down across some of the houses on Thistle. We have historic area down here that has largely been, ignored. And of course, the highway set that precedent by building on top of it. But the port or the wharf is down here in this neighborhood. And it's been sectioned off. Everybody can see it on the maps, and it's been ignored. And it shouldn't be, especially if we're going to talk about rezoning. We should, allocate or, make sure that it doesn't get continually being ignored. It should be identified. It should be, something should be done with it, and not just sort of bulldozed over and built on. And I really think that it's important, like, everybody said that we need more time. Clearly, there are a lot of questions. We haven't had a lot of time to see the presentations and digest them, et cetera. There are serious concerns. I agree that we're taking the bulk of it over here. It's really offensive to talk about maintaining, neighborhood sizes and things like that. But we're all 2.5 stories here, but you're okay with putting a 4.5 story across the street, and not just a 4.5 story building, but like an entire complex. It's unfair. And, all of these things I think need to be addressed so that we all feel good about it before it gets submitted. And what are the consequences if we're 6 months late? Like, what could the damages possibly be versus the damages if we push this through? And I think those are all of my comments, and you've heard most of them, and everybody else has the same, but it's really upsetting. And I really think we just need more time.
So I keep on doing this. I'm muting myself. So I'll try to address a couple of those. But I mean, one thing that I just want to make sure that because we are kind of, it's 9:15. I kind of wanted to be done by 9, but I want to make sure we get through everybody. So we've got 2 more hands up. You've identified a lot of kind of history and kind of information about this particular site that actually it probably is more beneficial to the town and to your neighborhood than I think you realize. We are trying to create zoning that complies with this law that the state has handed down. And I kind of tried to walk through in as much detail as I could the sort of the inherent tension between the requirements that we have and the planning principles that we've been trying to use to sort of guide us. There are already 200 something cars coming in and out of 2 Granite Ave, 300 something parking spaces on the park and ride lot that are all coming in and out at the same time and exacerbating, those traffic conditions at the peak hour. One of the things about residential development that we find whenever we do these traffic impact analysis for these large projects is that it's safe to assume that a good chunk of people are going to be leaving the house around the same time and coming back around the same time if you got a 9 to 5 in the city. But one way to guarantee that everyone is coming in at the same time is to have an office building. With a residential building, some people don't work, Some people work from home. Some people work weird hours. Some people work here. Some people work there. So the traffic, even though there are kind of peak hours and kind of off peak hours, is much more ebb and flow than the existing commercial and, whatever they're using the park and ride lot for. Those cars are coming in, on a pretty regular basis at the worst possible time. So even though, some of these redevelopments, are kind of, will be relatively large compared to the nothing that's there right now, you know, they're not going to have that same kind of traffic impact. I think the other thing, you mentioned a lot of kind of historic kind of, soils and flooding kind of concerns. The compliance model and the zoning is concerned with a flat parcel on a plan and the zoning parameters that we put in. If the state comes in and they see that the soils are incompatible with development, if there are wetlands that are encroaching on the building envelope, that our zoning allows, those are all things that eat away at the potential size of a development and could potentially make redevelopment impossible. I don't know what the soils are like. I don't know exactly where the wetlands lines are, but these are all things that a potential developer of that land is going to have to figure out and kind of work around, and that affects the viability of a development. The conditions there relative to flooding, it's pavement, it's flat pavement. Um, when you do a redevelopment, you are now responsible for controlling the stormwater and the flood water that comes across your site. And again, we find this with every redevelopment we see with stormwater conditions, that conditions are improved over even an existing kind of grass field is not treating stormwater and floodwater as efficiently and effectively as an actual engineered stormwater system. So, we definitely hear those comments. And again, I think, there's a worst case scenario that a lot of people are imagining. And I think what I'm trying to do is just kind of present everyone with all of the different nuance and all the different factors that, are kind of going to work to ameliorate those kind of worst case scenario kind of situations. The last thing I'll say is, again, I can't tell you what to do. We do want this to be, an opportunity for town meeting members to ask questions. So, I would appreciate it, if you're not a town meeting member, to maybe, take a step back, so that we get any town meeting members, that are remaining, that want to ask a question. So next we've got Linda Lee Sheridan, Gene Burns, and then John Cook. And I'm going to say, after those three, we're going to have to wrap it up. And if anyone knows if we beat Walpole, that would be great. I know everyone is here instead of watching the Wildcats in the Super Bowl, but I am very interested, as I'm sure other people are. Linda Lee.
Thank you, Tim. I'm Linda Lee Sheridan, town meeting member from Precinct 9. Just thank you so much for your time and all that you've put into this and sharing the presentations. One quick question that you don't even have to answer now, but I think it would be important to answer at town meeting is the impact on the schools, because we are talking about building a new school. Currently, our buildings are just, bursting at the seams, and we're looking at adding additional housing. So I think it's important that you address that at town meeting, but you don't have to take the time now. If you want to move on to other people, I understand. Thank you.
Linda, thank you very much. Obviously, we just went through a pretty bruising town meeting this year, around kind of, getting a new school built. So this is definitely something that, is top of mind, for everybody. One thing that the fiscal impact analysis and just, something to understand about multifamily housing versus single family housing is, single family housing is just the number one generator of school age children and households with school age children. And once you go denser from that up the scale, even from detached single family to attached single family, 2-family, 3-family, small apartment buildings, the more the unit count goes up, the more the school age children goes down. And we see this borne out constantly in census data, in real world data from developments. And so, I don't want to kind of discount the idea that there could potentially be additional school children. But what we have found, and RKG has modeled this, and they apply a factor to this based on their own research, which is again rooted in census data, and also their own kind of proprietary kind of information about what kind of ratios they assume for school age children. I'll just give you, again, this is based on a lot of research that they've done. A 1-bedroom market rate apartment, they factor in 0 school age children from that. They just find that kids are not living in 1-bedroom market rate apartments. The ratio for a 2-bedroom is 0.05 school age children. Only, out of all the different iterations of 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, condo, townhome, affordable units, the only place where you have in their analysis, which again is rooted in research, both census data and kind of, actual kind of building data that they have access to, the only time that you're getting more than 1 school age child in a unit is factored into a 3-bedroom affordable unit. So the market rate units that we see being built, in the region right now are almost exclusively 1 and 2 bedrooms, which are just generating, a negligible number of school age children. So, just to kind of put the, put a kind of a pin in it, under the full build out situation where, 2,586 units get built, which again, we've talked about is impossible and will not happen. 265 estimated school age children in that kind of pie in the sky, worst case scenario, kind of full build out situation. And then obviously even less in some of the other, iterations. So really good question, really important question. Not that we're not concerned about it, but, it's something that is going to wind up over the course of the pace that these units we anticipate being developed, we think is something that we need to keep an eye on, but is also manageable. We've got Gene Burns next.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, Gene.
Hi. So thank you so much. This has been very informative. And I came into this with like a couple questions, which you answered throughout the course of your presentation. Before I was a Precinct 3 town meeting member, I was Precinct 6 for 10 years. So my question, coming in was like, why are you developing in East Milton Square and why not other places like Randolph Ave? And you've kind of answered that question. But then after hearing just some of the comments from Precinct 7 town meeting members and residents, just a question kind of popped into my head. Like you were saying, if they were to develop the Granite Ave corridor and how it could actually be beneficial for traffic and things like that, since it seemed like your 2 final kind of groupings of districts, the one that did not include East Milton Square included parts of Randolph Ave. Is that correct? Is there any, just looking at it from that point of view where like Randolph Ave is problematic from a traffic perspective, would having that be one of the sub-districts versus East Milton Square, would there be any benefit to that as far as improving traffic and safety on Randolph Ave?
There could be. I mean, for the same reason that, Granite Ave is a state road, Randolph Ave is obviously a state road, and so the same conditions would apply. Developments would need to get, an access permit from MassDOT. That would include mitigation measures. I think that there's other reasons why you look at some of those parcels and they're not. They don't fit as well into kind of the matrix of different planning principles that we have. One reason, there's already, the one Randolph Ave parcel does, incorporate one of the approved 40Bs, but there's already a 40B going in, across the street. So there's already development happening in that part of town. I think the other, one other reason is that, again, the the problems that we've heard on Granite Ave are also, the on-ramp is right there, and that creates a lot of traffic and backup. But it also means that the on-ramp is right there, and that traffic is not spending a lot of time on Milton streets. It's getting onto the expressway and getting out. When you're putting a lot of development on Randolph Ave, you're putting development at sort of the bottom of the map as opposed to the top of the map. And that creates all manner of kind of downstream kind of impacts on traffic for the rest of the town. Which again is not to say, we don't want to kind of, single out Granite Ave just because they are by the on-ramp, but there's already development happening on Randolph Ave over there. It is, been identified, and Granite Ave is not the best, but I mean, we have reason to believe that Randolph Ave is a particularly dangerous street. We just had MassDOT in for a road safety audit the other day. Parallels to Granite Ave, we understand. But again, when you talk about those, those planning principles that we have where, again, understanding that, that Cortlandt Circle, Thistle Ave, Riverside neighborhood is kind of adjacent to this. But when you're developing on Randolph Ave, you are developing in single family neighborhoods, not just adjacent to single family neighborhoods, you're cheek to jowl with single family neighborhoods. So it's definitely, it's when I talk about trade-offs, when I talk about tensions, when I talk about tough decisions, I mean it. These are not decisions that came across lightly. But when we're looking at, how can we get developments that are going to sort of maximize our ability to create positive developments as opposed to, developments that may have, negative impacts. We look at, a state parcel. We look at parcels that are at the farthest outskirts of town at 2 Granite Ave. We look at parcels that are, again, close to single family neighborhoods, but not necessarily in single family neighborhoods. It's close. It's like a razor thin margin between kind of how do you weigh these different priorities. But again, this is kind of, part of the decision making process that we made. So, Gene, I appreciate that question. It's definitely something that we looked into. And again, these are tough decisions. So I think we had John Cook was our last hand. Linda, I know that you raised your hand again. We want to make sure we kind of get folks out of here. It's already 9:30. So, John, if you want to let us know what precinct you're from. John, you're still muted.
Can you hear me now, Tim?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. I'm obviously live down here by Granite Ave, and I wanted to mention the park and ride. I leave really early in the morning. That traffic, they don't contribute to the traffic. That's usually full. Lot's usually full by 5 a.m. It's mostly construction workers. They don't contribute to the backups in the morning. And I'm hearing a lot of hypotheticals from you, theories, possibilities. But I have a question for you, and I want to know if in fact this gets fully developed. Now, again, comments have been made about the state wanting this, so we don't know. You don't know. If it were to get fully developed across the street from us, 530 units, would you consider that an out of character development?
I think my personal opinion on that is actually not really relevant to the conversation. So, I don't think it matters whether I think it's out of character or in character or not.
You don't think it matters? You're drafting this whole thing. All I hear about is the character of the neighborhoods being maintained, and I'm wondering why that doesn't apply here.
So one of the priorities and principles that we used in choosing some of these sub-districts, again, is, where is their existing capacity? And, we understand, Granite Ave is, the traffic and the peak hour
I
is,
don't, Tim,
uh,
I don't think,
John,
I
John,
think you're
I'm
glossing
trying to
over.
answer your question.
Okay, I just think you're glossing this traffic situation over, Tim. It is a disaster. It's not solvable. It's one road. It's the gateway in and out of this town. You can't move out of here in the morning, and then when it's not plugged, it's a racing strip. It's very dangerous. Yeah, I would venture to say that it's more dangerous than Randolph Ave, and definitely more dangerous than any other road except Randolph Ave. It's an extremely dangerous road down here. We've had numerous serious accidents down here, Tim. And
No,
you
John,
want to add how many cars would you think, if it's fully developed, in your estimation, how many automobiles would that entail?
I don't have those numbers at the tip of my fingers. I mean, obviously, if there's a large development, there's the potential for a significant amount of cars being on the site, although, not more than 1.5 times the number of units that get developed. I think,
So 800.
it could be so, John. I mean, I've tried to explain over the course of this meeting why it's highly unlikely that the full unit capacity on any of these parcels gets developed. I've tried to underscore why that unit capacity number is really a kind of not a great framework to evaluate, what is actually a reasonable expectation for build out. So, I understand it's a number that's out there. I understand it's a number that looks frightening to folks, but I think there's a number of factors about, development in this town generally, and on those Granite Avenue parcels specifically, that, you're not going to see as much development as the model is spitting out. And I think, the thing about Granite Ave is, you know, we've gotten some improvements at Squantum and Granite Ave. Um, you know, it's a long road between Squantum and the bridge. And those improvements that road needs in terms of safety, because I understand, it's straight. I drive there. I've ridden my bike there. It's bananas. The improvements that we need for safety over there are not going to happen because MassDOT decides to do it. They're going to happen because development happens on Granite Ave. And we haven't seen development because there hasn't
What
been.
do you consider an improvement, Tim? Like a traffic light or a bus stop? That's not an improvement. That's not going to do anything.
Well, I mean, John, I'm talking about the safety of the road, which I think is funny. There's nothing we can do about traffic congestion. Town of Milton sits between the South Shore and City of Boston, and there's an on-ramp there.
Yeah, but you're
There's
exacerbating it 50-fold, though. That we know there's nothing that can be done. That's a disingenuous argument. The traffic is everywhere. What you're talking about is adding hundreds of cars right opposite my street. All of East Milton is going to get choked off with this, not just down here. You're talking about, you just said it, 800 cars. That's a minimum.
John, I didn't say 800 cars because
You said 1.5 times the unit numbers. That's
and
about 800. I don't have a calculator with me.
and John, I've also said that I don't think the full amount of units that the unit
You don't
capacity
know.
John,
Do you know that?
I don't think
There's
that
a lot of
rest of this.
that's all
John,
I'm hearing. Don't
I think
worry, there's not going to be that many units. You
John,
don't know that,
I
Tim.
don't think this is turning into a very productive conversation. So I think, we've heard your perspective. We understand it. I think that we disagree on the ultimate impact of this. But we definitely appreciate hearing from you. I know that you've been working, particularly closely with Mike Zulus from the select board. We've been trying to hear, what you folks have to say. I hope that you've heard what I've had to say about, the nuances of development and how they're a little bit more, complicated and
Well, didn't
probably.
RKG say it's highly likely to be developed, big time development there, Tim?
John, I'm not going to speculate. Okay, so.
And we haven't, and by the way, we haven't been working with Mike Zulus. We met with him one time and he sat with us. It was very unproductive. He had nothing to say to us. We wanted more disbursement of these units. He had nothing to say. All right. We haven't been working with him at all. A couple of emails and we met with him because he knew we were upset about it. And he didn't resolve anything with us. So we haven't been working with him.
All right, John, I,
between him and
we definitely,
Lowell
we
and the
appreciate
other
your
guy.
comments, John. I have to close out this meeting because we're way beyond time. So, you know, I really appreciate you coming. You know, we've got one more hand up. Elaine, I've got to, oh, all right. Well, okay. Elaine, if you can be quick, please. Elaine, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'll be super quick. I just wanted to thank you. It's been a long meeting, obviously, and you know, this is not the first time that you've got in front of the community and shared you know, so much information about this law and all of the tireless efforts that you've done over 2 years of work. And I just simply wanted to thank you for all of your dedication and ensuring thoughtful and effective town planning and how much it's truly appreciated. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Elaine. So again, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. You know, I think, you know, we've had some, obviously some tough comments and tough questions. I'm here to take those tough questions and tough comments. I hope you folks have learned, a little bit, and hopefully we have, you know, just as good, a conversation at town meeting, on Monday. Please check out the website, townofmilton.org/MBTA. You can find a link to it off of the planning department website, off the, planning board website. Everything we've ever done on this is up there. So all these materials, you know, will be up there. And, you know, again, thanks again. Have a great night. Have a great weekend, and we will see you on Monday.